Hi guys. Today we'll be taking a look at a 5-round rapid tournament I played in back in February. Um, Before we begin, I do want to say that to anyone who's thinking about getting into tournament chess, just go to a rapid tournament. These are significantly less taxing than classical tournaments. They are not as time consuming and they are not as tiring. Classical tournaments can be very difficult. And you get to just play a bunch of games, analyze your play and your games, and just meet a lot of new people who are interested in chess. It's the perfect way to get into tournament play and kind of enjoy yourself. Just don't think too much about the results. Just think about playing with people on an actual board and playing as best as you can because you do get time. It's not blitz like people usually play online. It's just a lot of fun. I really recommend it, and it was a lot of fun for me, which is why a lot of the games that I'm analyzing are rapid games that I played over the board. I'm also a student, and I'm sure that the same is true for most of you, but not all of us can expend as much time as we need to in order to play classical chess. It takes so much time. Sometimes it's full days. So today, as I said, a 5-round rapid tournament that I took part in. Um, the rating limit for the tournament was up to 1900. So my opponents they weren't masters. I wasn't ever facing really strong opponents, but I was facing people who are about my level. I think during this tournament I was 1850, so I was kind of on the upper limit of the tournament rating list. And I think this could be very interesting to some of you because, a lot of us watch masters online, we watch masters on YouTube, and we see those really strong players. But I think that seeing people who are closer to our level, it can be very useful to our games. We can understand the play way more, and we can actually relate to the plans and the ideas that the players have. While, to a 1600 player as an example, I think it's better to see how an 1800 or a 1900 plays rather than a 2700 whose play is just incomprehensible. So, with that said, let's get into the first game, and we will only be looking at the first game today. We'll divide it into one game per video. So in the first game, I was against Anatoly. I don't remember his rating. I remember he was pretty close to me in rating. I think he was 1750 or something. I'm not sure though. I got black in the first round, and my opponent began with e4. I think I said the same thing last time in the last tournament that I showed you guys, but I was kind of switching. I was in the middle of a switch between e5 and c5. I was kind of wondering about what to do against e4. In e5 openings, I was having a lot of trouble playing against the Ruy Lopez. I just could not find an adequate way to defend and find myself in good positions against the Ruy Lopez. Even when I played against weaker players, I found myself climbing back up from worse positions that they could not necessarily capitalize on their advantage, but still I don't like leaving the opening in uncomfortable and in a disadvantageous position. So I tried studying some different lines of the Ruy Lopez. I wasn't really successful. While I was playing this tournament, I was at the time when I was playing the Knight of Sicilian. So I proceeded with c5. And my opponent heads for the open Sicilian. Knight f3, d6, and then he kind of changes his plan with bishop to c4. This is still absolutely equal. It's fine, but you know what? I'll put the engine on and I'll just see. Yeah, you guys can see the bar. Just you'll have something. So as you can see, the game is still equal. It's fine. Bishop c4 is not a terrible blunder or anything, but it's also not a very ambitious try. I mean, it commits the bishop way too early, and now that I know that the bishop is on this diagonal, I know not to play anything like I don't remember the name of the variation, but anything that opens up this light square diagonal. I know that I'm just going to play probably e6 very soon. I didn't play it right away, but the bishop doesn't have any future here. So he just committed his bishop too early, but once again, it's not a terrible blunder by him. I began by playing knight c6. He played knight to c3, simply developing and probably soon going into, I assumed at least, going into the open Sicilian, because the closed Sicilian does not include the bishop on c4. I went with knight to f6, and he played knight to g5, which is obviously a mistake, and you can see the bar going just a little bit in my direction. So he's kind of, the fact that I didn't play e6 yet kind of pays its dividends. He had no threat, and so I just developed my knight, and there was no reason to play e6. And now there is a reason, but at the same time, he's just attacking a pawn that I can defend very easily, and then his knight is going to be vulnerable to attack, like h6, which is a useful move when my king is castled kingside and I will have an escape square. So he just kind of wasted a move. I played e6. Probably the best way to make sense of this knight g5 move is now to play f4, which is a very common plan in Sicilian positions, kind of justifying why you move the knight away from the path of the f-pawn. It's a very common structure. In this case, it's not good because I can play d5 and just I'm just having a great time. I'm developed. My center is huge and my opponent is getting kicked back. But f4 was the only way to make sense of this maneuver. But he didn't play it. Instead, he played castles. I played h6, kicking his knight back, and once again blocking the f pawn. By the way, the reason that f4 can be a good move is because it just gains some space on the king side. Once white castles, his rook is supporting the f pawn, and a very common plan in Fischer-Sozin attacks, for example, when the bishop is on c4 against the Najdorf and the classical Sicilian, is to play f5 and to try to open up the bishop to the bishop's diagonal and maybe clear up the d5 square for the knight, just overall weakening black's control over the light squares. It's a very common plan, which is why f4 is a great move. I mean, it's not a great move here, but it's a very thematic move. It makes sense and it goes along with white's play. Another very common thing to play is after maybe the knight goes back to f3, I castle e5 and kind of trying to break up my structure and also push the knight away from f6 where it defends the king side, and then white has a lot of space. My bishops are kind of uncomfortable. The engine gives some advantage to black because white's pawn is overextended in this case, and we can just kind of pile on the pressure and white has no way to defend the pawn. But my point is just to show you some plans, why, just so you can understand why f4 is a good move to include in so many positions. Probably these plans are much better after castling, and this system with e4 and f4 against the Sicilian is actually similar to one that I play a lot, the Grand Prix attack. As I said, instead my opponent castles, I play h6, knight f3, and bishop e7. I'm just preparing to castle kingside. And now my opponent heads for the open Sicilian with d4, only now kind of a delayed open Sicilian where he's down a tempo for nothing. I take the pawn, knight takes, and I castle. Because just makes sense. I mean, I played a lot of moves that are very rational in open Sicilian positions, but my opponents kind of wasted time by making me play these moves. And so if you remember, I said that I was at the time when I played the Najdorf Sicilian. As you can see, this is not a Najdorf structure. a6 is missing, but that's because I just decided to develop my knight more aggressively because white didn't play the most aggressive way that he could. He did not pressure me in the center, he did not castle queenside, and so I took some liberties. I developed more aggressively, and I didn't waste time with a6. So this is kind of a weird Sicilian sideline, not something that you would see every day. He played f4, finally. Now I remember looking at queen to b6 and bishop to e3, but a lot of times when the knight is only defended by the queen and attacked by the knight, queen to b6 can actually win either material or the bishop pair. because bishop to e3 and knight to g5. Now it doesn't work because the pawn is on e6, which is usually the case against bishop to c4 in the Sicilian. So my opponent can just take, and after I take the knight is pinned. So I will lose it back, or actually I'm not losing it back. Interesting, because I'm attacking the queen and I'm defending the knight, but yeah, he has a lot of kingside play, so I'm in some trouble. But I basically just saw that he can take the knight, and I decided that there's no reason to go for this. My play is just better, so I did something completely different. I'm sorry, I kind of spoiled the move here. I noticed that this is very similar to some positions in e4, e5 structures where you can play the centered fork trick, where you take on e4, and if your opponent takes back, you play d5 and fork the two pieces. My opponent decided to play f5, which kind of worsens the situation. In the center fork trick, my plan was just to kind of liquidate the center. I didn't intend to win a pawn, and I saw that I do not have any long-term prospect of winning a pawn. My opponent can play knight takes c6, for example, b takes c6, knight takes e4, and after d5 and bishop d3, or maybe even bishop e3, my structure is just terrible, and probably the engine gives black still some advantage, like -1, but nothing significant, and I'm not sure that it's anything that a human can take advantage of. I mean, my structure is terrible. I have this long-term weakness, and maybe white's weak king is adding to the advantage, but I don't really see it. But I saw it as equal. My opponent decided to play f5 now, which is just a few moves too late. Trying to confuse the situation, he saw that he can't outright win the pawn. I'm guessing he missed the lines where he just takes and allows me to take. I have doubled pawns and terrible pawns. After he takes, I have an isolated pawn here. He just missed those lines, and so he played f5. Seeing that he loses a pawn, he was trying to conjure up some kingside initiative, which is very common for this level of players, 1700s, 1800s, talking about myself too. I think this level of player is very good at recognizing when they made a mistake and then trying their best to conjure up an initiative and trying to make up for that lost material. So he kind of sees that my pieces are, my knight is vulnerable in the center, and he has a tempo to kind of stir up some trouble. So he opens up lines towards my king, right, trying to pry open the light squares as we saw is a very common thing to do in these kind of structures. So he's just opening up lines and preparing to attack. But in these kind of situations, you should kind of see what you can do to simplify the situation as much as you can. So right away, I can just trade the knight, a pair of knights, which is perfect, and also double his pawns. I'm attacking the queen as well, so he must take back. And now I played e5. I think d5 was also great, but then I wasn't sure about like why allow the bishop to go on a. Oh, I thought that I'm allowing the bishop to get on a better diagonal, but now e5, and after the knight move, I can play e4. Great spot by the engine. Instead, I played e5. Now I am opening up my light squares, but I'm doing it when the knight has to be kicked away and the knight has no way to get to d5. And if the knight takes on c6, which I was sure he was going to do because the knight has no great squares. I mean, on f3 it has no moves, no forward moves basically. And on e2, the top move of the engine, once again it has no forward moves and it blocks the queen's diagonal towards the king side. So I just thought that the knight is sure to trade the knight, which he did. The engine actually gives knight to e2 as the best move, as I said, and I think it's about knight to g3 to h4, maybe planning just to long-term try to attack the king. And I'm still at -1 after e5. d5 was way better, but Not a serious difference, just some engine lines that are difficult to see and understand, I guess, at a rapid time control. So I played e5, kicking away the knight with tempo, and he took my knight on c6, but now his bishop is going to be dead, because I take b takes c6, and I'm going to play d5 and block off his bishop completely. He played the second best move, queen to h5, kind of just preparing to sacrifice on h6 and trying to open some lines, maybe trying to get a perpetual against my king, maybe even checkmate me. It's beginning to look a little bit menacing with the bishop pointing here and the queen and the bishop here and the rook just two moves from getting to my king, but I was absolutely confident that my situation is great. I wanted to begin by trying at least to trade and completely neutralize his sacrifice. Just make sure that bishop takes h6 does not even come on the board. Maybe in classical you can allow that, but I wasn't interested in starting to calculate some lines and maybe making a mistake somewhere. Similar to Blitz, you don't want to risk anything that you don't have to risk. No need to allow this and calculate some long line where it actually works and you save your king. Just bishop to g5. Trying to trade bishops, and once he takes, offering a trade of queens as well, his bishop is going to be blocked off after d5. His pawns are doubled. It's a great situation for me. He found an interesting move, f6, which only gives me one move for equality, obviously. I say obviously because it's a move that makes a lot of sense tactically. He's blocking the defense of the queen. Obviously, the queen can take on f6 because the rook is defending that. And if the bishop takes, then the sacrifice is once again possible. And now the rook is on the bishop, and there's a lot of pressure on my king side. And this is actually a nice sacrifice, and I saw that I can refute it, but a nice couple of moves by him. He also opened up his f-file in the process, so he's just playing with the initiative, trying to gain an initiative, although it obviously doesn't work, but it's not easy to see why. Because let's say I just take back, he takes with the queen. Actually, he doesn't have to take with the queen right away. He plays queen to g6 because the pawn is pinned because of the bishop on c4. So suddenly the bishop shows why it's so important. Now, if king to h8, then queen to h6, and white is actually winning. And just rook takes f6. This is not defended anymore because the king was defending it and the pawn was defending it. I'm sorry. And I'm in a terrible situation. I'm about to lose some. And if I block with the bishop on g7, then rook takes f7 suddenly arrives, and my situation is looking kind of dire. I have to take, and he takes. Engine gives some insane lines with rook to f1, just piling up on the pinned piece, and yeah, crazy stuff. So I basically spotted only this variation. I did not see any further, and I did not think about taking, and if I can survive that, not to move further. I just decided that, okay, I can't allow him to take back with the queen, attack the bishop, and give me some trouble on g6. Just d5, first of all. Best move in the position, blocking the bishop, so queen to g6 is never again a problem. And his sacrifice is still, it's as if he's giving me he's giving me another move to consider the sacrifice. Not really, because I did it myself. I'm attacking another piece, but the point is that he can't just back off because I'm playing a defensive move. It's a defensive move that also attacks a piece. So I'm forking the bishops and I will take one of them. And now when I take the bishop on h6, I will be able to play bishop to g7, and f7 is no longer attacked so harshly. So he played bishop to e2. I think rook takes f6 was the best move, after which queen to f6, and it's the only way to proceed with the initiative, to play bishop to g5, but it's not really working. Nothing is really working here because the initiative isn't that serious. So d5, as I said, he played bishop to e2. seeing that if he plays bishop to d3, I just play e4 and I block off his bishop, and once again two pieces are hanging. So bishop to e2, and now g takes. f7 is not under that much pressure, and if he takes, I can just play bishop to g7, queen somewhere, bishop comes to the defense. I saw that after bishop to g7, he can play queen to h5, and I remember thinking that's probably his best try. Just saying to me, hey, you're missing your g and h pawns, and I'm going to go for an attack still. But I just have so much material. I mean, it is the way to cause the most problems. I am queen to h5 and going to for rook to f3, and actually my play, although I do have a lot of space, but my play is not coming that quickly. Maybe I'll play e4, attacking the pawn, but and blocking off his bishop from any active squares. But my play is kind of slow, and my center, while strong, is not does not give any immediate results. So we can proceed to build, and I need to find some ways to defend. Instead, I also noticed, obviously, that he can take the pawn on c6 after bishop to g7. But I remember just thinking, but then queen to b6, he takes the queen, and I'm just up a piece with two open files on isolated pawns, a beautiful center, the bishop there, I'm completely winning there. So I was way more worried about queen to h5, where I have to play a long defensive game. But he might have missed that because h5 is actually the only square that's available for the queen anywhere on the king side. So he might have just missed the fact that queen to h5 was possible. Anyway, he played queen takes c6, and I played queen to b6, forking the queen and the king. So now I'm forcing a trade of queens when I'm up a piece. Queen takes b6, a takes b6, and now it's just the simplest mop-up job. There's no, seriously no try that white can pull. I think queen to h5, while queen to h5 does show the same advantage, it's -4, just like queen to c6. Queen to h5 is just a better try practically. You just cause more problems, and humans are not going to play perfectly. So he might have evaluated the position correctly, but I do think that queen to h5 was practically the better choice by a lot. Queen takes b6, a takes b6, and I'm eyeing the a2 pawn. My opponent tries to trade as many pawns as he can, but it's important in these kind of positions to remember that if we trade everything, if we trade both rooks and the bishops and somehow trade all of the pawns, then it's a draw because the bishop does not checkmate the king. So a good rule of thumb to follow is not to trade a lot of pawns, because it just might allow white better opportunities for a draw. Not really relevant in this situation. I might also, oh, I'm down a pawn, but this is not really a situation where that's relevant, but I did want to just, as I said, not calculate to the end, not see anything, just make sure to maintain as strong winning chances as I can, not give anything away. So I played bishop to a6, a nice move. My opponent cannot take on b6 because I win the bishop, and if he takes my bishop, it allows me to keep my rook active on the a file while defending the pawn. And obviously right now I can't defend the pawn because, I mean, I can, but it's just incredibly passive. There's no reason to put my rook on a closed file. So bishop to a6 is actually a nice move. And he played rook f2 e1, trying to exchange on his own terms, trying to defend and allow himself to capture on b6. But I just played e4, defending the pawn so that he has absolutely no pressure there, and I'm also threatening the c3 pawn now. So my bishops come to life, and if he takes on b6, then it's still a wonderful situation for me. I'm starting to win all of his pawns, and my situation is great. I'm not losing anything, and he will lose the pawns. So he decided of his own volition to take on a6 and free up his rook, I guess. Rook e to d1, aiming at the weak pawn. I play rook to d8, just defending the pawn, and as I said, trying to prevent any pawn exchanges because I see that his pawns are so weak, I can just win them outright, so why trade any of them? He played c4, trying to trade the pawns because the pawn is pinned to my rook, so I can take, so he wants to take and maybe just trade as many pawns as he can to allow himself a draw, but I play d4, and now I have a connected passed pawn, only the c2 pawn is now preventing them from being two connected passed pawns. The e4 pawn is now passed. It has no pawns in the way, so it can just move to promotion. The only limit is pieces, the opponent's rooks and king. He played king to f1, just trying to assist in the defense and hoping, as I said, that he can trade as many pawns as he can and maybe head for a draw on endgame somehow. But I spot a nice move because my rook is kind of holding on to the b6 pawn and I don't want to let go of the pawn that's holding on. Oh, sorry. I don't want to let go of the pawn that's holding on to two passed pawns by him. So I find this nice move to anchor my bishop on c5, block any play that he has along the fifth file. Maybe he could play rook to b5 and rook to d5 to block my defense. Just, play as safe as you can, just bishop to c5, defending all of my weaknesses. f5 will defend the last one, and then my rooks can just mop up all of his pawns very easily. So bishop to f8 is a nice move. I played a good conversion game in this one. Very well played by me after I gained the advantage. My opponent put on some powerful pressure. He played well as well. So rook b5, I guess recognizing the fact that I'm about to block the row when I played bishop to c5. My opponent defended the pawn on a2, but it doesn't matter because so many of his pawns are weak and now there's literally no way to defend the c4 pawn. And after I take, I'm attacking c2 as well. After rook to c1, rook to a8. It's the principle of two weaknesses. My opponent cannot defend when he has so many weak pawns that are also difficult to defend. I mean, the rook is very passive now. So he just made a nothing move, and I proceeded to take all of his pawns. He traded just one pair of pawns, but now it doesn't matter because I have two passed pawns and it's minus 40. The engine can surely in just a few moments, yeah. Now it's showing mate in 19. I saw that I can just sacrifice the bishop because my pawn gets promoted. He cannot stop. He cannot go back because I advanced the other pawn. So I can just sacrifice the bishop with d3. Rook takes c5, rook takes c5, rook takes c5, and d2. And he cannot stop the pawn. Both squares that would defend the queening square are blocked, one by the rook and one by the pawn. That's a nice pattern to remember. When a pawn is one square from promotion and the rook is one file adjacent to the pawn, the rook cannot stop the pawn. So my opponent played queen to g2 at this point, surely just looking for some stalemate trap, trying to limit his moves. Now the king only has two moves and he blocked the a pawn, so he's hoping for some rook sacrifice, but he just has too many pawns and the king can move freely still. I played rook to d5, just trying to activate my rook and go for a checkmate as quickly as possible. Rook to c8, king to g7. And at this point my opponent resigned. I'm just up a queen and I'm very close to just mating him on the board in just a few moves. So a great start to the tournament. First game a win, a very nice win against a strong player, not as strong as me, but still it's nice to win the first round of a tournament, gives you some confidence. So a wonderful start. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you'll see the next game in the tournament as well, and I'll see you next time.